Yes, we focus on a very important matter. Enough is enough for NGOs calling for government to release funding to improve the state of shelters for abused women in the country. The Western Cape Women's Shelter Movement and the National Shelter Movement of South Africa have handed over a memorandum asking for government to implement the recommendations which were set out in the Commission for Gender Equality's investigative report. The Commission looked at the state of shelters in the country. Well, for more on this, Joy Lange from the National Shelter Movement of South Africa is joining us now live from our Cape Town studios. Joy, good morning, and thank you very much for your time. Well, the memorandum and your protest action happened on Tuesday, and that took place. Do you think you are being heard?
Good morning, Dan, and good morning to all your viewers. Yes, indeed. You know, on Tuesday we had torrential rains and we braved that storm. And what also then happened was that Minister Lindiwe Zulu, who is the National Minister for Social Development, actually came out in that weather to sign that memorandum with us, and she also addressed us in terms of saying that she has read the memorandum and also visited a shelter, happened to visit a shelter the previous week, and therefore understood exactly what women's shelters were doing for survivors of domestic violence and gender-based violence.
It seems to me like one of the biggest challenges here is about funding on two levels. One is the fact that these centers are underfunded, and secondly, that the funding is not consistent.
That is absolutely true, Dan, because the CGE's investigative report actually corroborates what the National Shelter Movement's research finding was that they did for the past 3 years in partnership with the Handikpol and the EU. And it actually highlights the disparities that takes place not only across provinces but within provinces as well. For example, a subsidy in one province to house a woman for 1 day would range from 9 Rand per day to another province that would be 71 Rand per day. So that's a huge disparity in terms of housing women, because we are then in direct violation of our constitution in terms of equity and fairness to survivors.
The other issue that you have raised in your memorandum and you are hoping will be addressed is the employment of the staff that works in these shelters, like managers, social workers, house mothers, and so on, because, of course, they are underpaid, and we are also concerned that they are receiving less than the national minimum wage.
That is absolutely true, because and that is what you also find, that in some provinces, some core staff will be receiving less than national minimum wage, which is then not also the case in other provinces. And then in addition to that, when the report also looks at NGOs who are providing the services and comparing to government-run NGOs, government-run shelters, and there's a disparity. For example, a social worker in an NGO shelter will earn less than a social worker in a government-run shelter. And in addition to that, there's also the thing of a government-run shelter that would have all the services. For example, they would have psychologists that would speak different languages, whereas in the NGO shelter, that is really not the case. There's not even a psychologist. And for example, also a government-run shelter will have, for example, a gym for the women, whereas NGOs barely scrape to survive, let alone the fact that there are other challenges with regards to building maintenance and repairs. There are no funding that is given within the agreements for that, for NGO shelters as well.
Now, before you go, Joy, recently my partner Uveka was up and about in Cape Town ahead of the elections, and one of the women who was coming out of the shelters gave us an interview and spoke to Uveka, and she was claiming that they go to some of these shelters in Cape Town, for example, and they don't get the support that they need, it looks like the money, even this little money, these little subsidies that are being given, don't end up benefiting the women who seek shelter in them. The people who run them keep the money for themselves. Do you know anything about that?
No, I cannot speak on that because as the Western Cape Women's Shelter Movement and the National Shelter Movement, we have not heard anything of that nature. What could also be the challenge is that, you know, in addition to the funding that government gives, NGOs actually have to go and source additional funding. For example, where the NGO, the shelter that I work at, we receive 40% of our funding from government, which is a huge contribution. However, I have to go and find the 60% that we have to have to complete the annual budget. And so some shelters are not that fortunate because they are, for example, based in a rural area as opposed to an urban area. And so the infrastructure around that in terms of finding the necessary donors is also a challenge.
Okay, finally, the Minister Lindiwe Zulu came out, received your memorandum in the pouring rain on Tuesday. Very briefly, Joy, what has she promised to do? Do you think your request or your demands will be met?
Well, we are very hopeful that our demands will be met, but we've also said that as a collective we will be engaging the Minister and her department, and so we'll be journeying with him. She has promised to engage with us. She has promised to look at it with the other government departments as well, and so she has said that she will be in engagement with us as a collective. And so we are hopeful for that, but we will also do our part in terms of engaging her as well.
Thank you very much. That's Ms. Joy Lange. She's from the National Shelter Movement of South Africa, talking about their demands that have been delivered to government regarding the need to release funding in order to improve the state of shelters for abused women in the country.